Gaming Institute podcast. I'm your host, Ben. Today we're here with Mr. Dan, the CTO of Studio 369, which has a wonderfully cool project called MetalCore. So, Dan, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So, I'd love to just kind of dig in and get started here. I would love to understand your story and how you got to where you are, and then we can talk about all things crypto gaming.
Yeah, so I've been a game developer for like 15 years, over 15 years now. Got my start at Midway Games, working on stuff like Mortal Kombat, Stranglehold, and then they got bought by Warner Brothers. I kind of left and joined a kind of a startup game studio in Chicago called Phosphor Games. Became the tech director and CTO there. Worked on a bunch of different things, and then eventually moved to kind of form my own studio, which has then kind of merged with another studio to become what we are now, which is Studio 369. We're developing MetalCore, which is an NFT-based multiplayer mixed arms shooter, very much in the vein of Battlefield 2042 or Star Wars Battlefront or PlanetSide 2, taking a lot of inspiration from those games. And we're going for kind of like a big persistent territory war with massive battles of players on both sides, piloting aircraft, mechs, or running it on foot to fight one another. So we're very excited to show you guys what we have in the near future.
That's totally rad. So let's talk a little bit about your history, because Mortal Kombat's like one of my favorite games, and
Nice.
I'm not particularly good at it. I get my ass kicked a lot.
I'm terrible. I'm terrible at it too. But give me a second. So 1 second.
All good. Friends, this is how you know that it's live, that it's real. This is the beauty of Web3, when we have young friends jumping in and trying to share their opinion on crypto as well. So
sorry, everybody. My kid's school's closed today, so we got some potential interruptions. Going to try not to pull a BBC moment right now.
All good. But, if they have an interesting perspective on crypto gaming, they're more than welcome to join us.
I'm sure she does. She's 6, but I'm sure she could give you some very interesting info that she has rattle around up there. Anyways, where was I? So I'm terrible at Mortal Kombat 2. But I worked on so I was working on Mortal Kombat versus DC Universe, like when I was on the team. So like kind of the original tie-in with Warner Brothers, when they kind of bought the Midway team and started saying like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had all our DC characters in the Mortal Kombat game? And then I started working on kind of a Mortal Kombat action adventure title, which ended up getting canceled, which I was actually mostly excited to work on, because I don't like fighting games, mostly because I'm so bad at them. So I end up being really attracted to them because they look so cool, and then like playing them for like 5 minutes and then being like, I can't do this anymore, because I always get like just pounded by anybody who plays against me, who even knows any amount of what they're doing, is just gonna like me. So but yeah, so I worked on that, and then kind of had a couple projects that got canceled within Warner Brothers Midway Games. I kind of got a little bit frustrated with working for a big company that would kind of like greenlight these really cool prototypes and big ideas. And I was like, I'm going to go work for a smaller team, a smaller company, startup, because then maybe I'd like be able to kind of ship more like short life cycle games, which turned out to be very true at Phosphor Games. But that came with its own set of challenges, but it was definitely like an interesting experience there. So, but yeah, that's all. I think I moved to Phosphor like over 10 years ago and started my own studio probably like 3 or 4 years ago. So to me, that's ancient history, I guess.
History, for sure. Well, the thing that I really wanted to dig in there was being the CTO. I mean, technology is such a critical component of games. And as we're seeing today in the world of crypto gaming and NFTs, technology is still such an important part of this. So from the technology perspective, like what interested you, and like what's your superpower within that technology realm that led you to then be the CTO of all these different organizations?
To be honest, like my main thing is I just really love solving like these really hard technical challenges. Like these sorts of things where it's like, okay, we definitely don't have the resources to do this in like the AAA way, but what are some interesting tricks that we could do as a small team to kind of approximate that, like to get like 80% of the way there,
Good enough.
by spending like 1% of the budget, right? And like I've always been really interested in kind of trying to like squeeze a value out of like cool tricks, technical tricks, and like my knowledge of the Unreal Engine 4, which I've been working in for like over 10 years now, even before it was available to the public. So I'm basically like just for a long time been kind of really interested in how do I big picture like get squeeze the most out of like the small team that we can put together, and like make the biggest and coolest experience that we can. And so that's kind of what I've been doing for a while now. So yeah.
That's awesome. And that, I think that is almost 100% the ethos of Web3 is like, how much can we do with how little? and, and so that's it's really interesting that that's kind of in your mindset. Coming from more of a traditional game building side, when did you get introduced to the world of crypto, and then how did that lead you into discovering NFTs? And then I want to talk about like how you made the decision to adopt that as a piece of technology, but really interested in the history of like how you got there.
Yeah, I'm pretty new to it. I mean, we basically started. I started kind of dabbling with it, honestly, like in 2019, late 2019, early 2020, when I knew that some of the investors in our studio, in our kind of newly formed studio, were very interested in that space. And so I kind of started, and they encouraged me to kind of start looking into that stuff. And so I kind of started dabbling a bit, but hadn't really considered working on a blockchain inspired game until probably more like 6 to 9 months ago, when we started to get approached by various groups that were really interested in our UE4 background. And then I really had to kind of dive into like, okay, what are the actual technical hurdles with doing this? What types of technology exist out there that we can leverage, and then just learning the basics of like, well, which blockchain platform, which blockchain would we want to be on, right? Like, and how does like an ERC20 token work and all that stuff, like from the business case all the way down to like the technical details of like how to implement the individual thing. Like, had to kind of crash course myself in it very quickly. So that's all.
Wow.
That's all like fairly recent stuff for me, but I found it really fascinating since getting to talk to a couple of the kind of pioneers in the industry that have started to have really pushed the envelope in terms of what is possible in blockchain games. Yeah, it's such a cool frontier. I've always been interested in kind of exploring these new frontiers in gaming, and this is kind of like the new one that I think has a lot of promise.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I'm so fascinated by this. You crash coursed it in like less than a year. And I feel like so many people are like forced to do that because you realize how quickly things are moving and how quickly you then need to move to like catch up almost. So, how did you actually go about performing that learning? Like, I know it might sound weird, but like, how did you actually go about doing that?
So the interesting thing about blockchain development is that like basically everything's open source, right? Like that's such a cool like part of the just inherent part of the uh, of the space is that you can kind of just go and look at what everyone else has done. And that's primarily what I did. I just kind of like went around and looked at CryptoKitties and like the simplest like implementation of one of the first blockchain kind of game, projects, and what did they do, and like like a lot of the the hard part of learning um a new technology like this is not necessarily like the syntax of like learning Solidity or learning any of these things. It's like be, figuring out what the best practices are, and the fact that these best practices are still being kind of trailblazed and forged, and looking at what different people are doing and trying to figure out if I think they did what I would have done, right? Like
Mhm.
that to me, that was like the best learning experience is kind of like almost doing it as like a code review and kind of looking at, oh, they did this, that, and this is interesting. And why did they do that? Like, these guys are smart guys. I never would have thought of doing it this way in a million years. It seems like a very inefficient way of doing things, but maybe it's necessary, and maybe I'm missing something, right? Like, kind of going through all this stuff, right? So, and by the way, I'll be the first to say that I am definitely not by far like the world's foremost expert on blockchain development. I basically learned as much of it as I needed to in order to like lead the team. But we have basically a team of blockchain experts who are doing the actual blockchain development. While I'm mostly leading the kind of game dev side. So we've got kind of like a combination of people who have spent the last 5+ years living and breathing this stuff, the blockchain side of it, with the people who have spent the last 15, 20, 30 years as professional game developers. So those kind of two groups being brought together under one organization.
So cool. That must be so fun to be in that room and be leading that team and having so many cool, smart people like bouncing ideas off each other. Is there tension there between the two sides?
No, honestly, not at all, because we're lucky to have partners that really believe in the idea that that the ideal that we have, which is that the game experience comes first. And
critical.
We're game developers, and first and foremost, we're making a game, and we're making a game for gamers. And one of the things that we really want to do is attract gamers who might not ever really have an interest, or might not currently have an interest in crypto, and still be like, hey, this is still a fun game. You should come be a part of our community, and maybe we can convert you later. You don't need a wallet to play. Like, you're not going to need a wallet to play our game. You can just log into an account and start to level up and start to have fun and meet other people, and then start to see all the cool stuff that other people are doing, and maybe decide that you're going to connect a new wallet or create a wallet in order to like partake in that, right? So I like, basically what I'm saying is that our ethos is like, it's for the gamers. It's a game experience for the gamers, and our blockchain team very much believes in that. So basically, anytime I've been like, we have to do it this way because this is the best design for gamers, this is the best like user experience, they've just been like, yep, we'll figure it out. Like, this crazy request that you have where we need like, a couple dozen different staking pools because this is the best like user experience for doing staking within the game environment. Okay, we'll make that work, even though like nobody else is doing that. So that's been a really cool experience for me.
That's amazing. So let's talk a little bit about. I know I kind of jumped ahead a little bit. I cut down myself, but let's jump back for a second and talk about the idea of learning this and catching up. So it seems like you went to the source and you started reviewing code enough to the point where you could then lead the team. And you kind of caught up on the blockchain side. But when you were studying this, like, did you start by learning like the definition of a blockchain, or did you jump into like the code of a blockchain? And then who did you decide to learn from? Like, who are the smartest people in the room that you're seeing just having been in the space?
So I had kind of been interested in the underlying mechanics of a blockchain like a while ago, right? So like I had spent some time, probably like 4, 5, 6 years ago, taking some time on my own back before I knew I was ever going to work on a blockchain related game, just to kind of educate myself on like, how does the fundamental like blockchain, like the simplest, or not the simplest, but like the most obvious, like Bitcoin, like how does Bitcoin work under the hood, right? So I had taken the time to educate myself on that, on the fundamentals of like the blockchain technology itself.
Through looking at the source code, or did you consume content?
just through like learning, online learning materials, like through just the simplest things, right? Like great YouTube videos that just
Gotcha.
explain it in varying degrees of like technical complexity, right? And like I'm fairly technical, so I'm like, there's some YouTube videos that are like, let me dumb this down, not dumb it down, right, but let me simplify this for the layperson, right? And then there are some that are like, I actually some people who are like, I have a very deep technical understanding of how like Bitcoin works, and I'm going to explain this in a fairly involved technical way. And like, there is a 2-hour long video that like I would watch, right? Like, just kind of like laying those foundations, but wasn't taking it seriously from a professional standpoint. Was mostly just like an interest, like a passing like technical interest of mine. Like, oh, how does this work? This is cool. And that's where like 6 to 9 months ago is when I started to really kind of dive into it more from a professional standpoint. Like that was more like, so 6 to 9 months ago was more like I kind of already had the foundation of like understanding the basics of like how like a transaction is processed on the blockchain on a given blockchain, right? And like the concept of proof of work and how the underlying cryptography works. But that's only like the very simplest portion of it, right? Like the idea of, like I said, the idea of the fundamentals of ERC20 and ERC721 tokens, like are a little bit more involved to understand, and that's where I had to kind of start like the simple specs of those, right? Like the actual like specs for how those things are defined, and how smart contracts work, right? Like those are some kind of more recent and more nuanced things that I had to learn, right? Like that stuff, the idea of a smart contract didn't really exist, obviously, until, EVM like was available, right, for people to publish code on, right? So,
right.
I mean, like the process of learning, has been kind of like a slow one over the past 5 years, but has accelerated rapidly in terms of like the more relevant stuff that you really need to know, especially when working on a blockchain gaming project over the past like 6 to 9 months. So that's kind of the process that I took.
Cool. And I appreciate you breaking that down for me. So as you were learning, and it seems like you were learning it with the intent of then using it and building that into the game. Did you discover what did you discover along the way about the importance of NFTs and blockchain for the future of gaming?
Wow, that's a pretty big question. The importance of blockchain and NFTs for the future of gaming. I guess my vision for it would be, like, and this is something that obviously we're still kind of exploring. Like, I won't pretend that we've solved this problem yet, but my like kind of ideal for where blockchain gaming goes in the future is something that can be some like killer experience that can kind of be some sort of endless experience for players to participate in, that can be truly and verifiably decentralized in a way where it can live on forever, theoretically, even past the demise of every corporation and every programmer that ever worked on it. And like the idea of something like, imagine if like some classic game experience that people will basically love to play forever, like take StarCraft for instance, StarCraft 2, right? Like there's a good chance that people will basically just want to play that forever. What if that was implemented in such a way that even if like Blizzard like didn't exist anymore, it just could live forever, right? And in like in a decentralized like StarCraft 2 is a simplified example, but like if Blizzard folds, like there's no servers for people to play on, right? You have to play peer to peer. That's not going to be fun. Like stuff like ideas like that, right? Like how can we truly decentralize a game so that a game developer is no longer necessary to sustain it, and it's really just about community interest and how many people are playing it. To me, that's kind of like the gold standard, the ideal of blockchain gaming.
So it's not even within the game that you're talking about. It's just the existence of the game itself,
the
being
operations
in perpetuity.
Of the game, right? Like the operations of the game is not in any way dependent on any single entity. The operations of the game have become decentralized to the point where people, and especially social games, especially games that are inherently interconnected, right? Because like, yeah, you can play like Super Mario like forever, right? As long as you have a NES emulator, right? But like an inherently connected and social game that can live forever despite without ever relying on any individual entity to control it, right? Like that to me is such a cool concept. And even like in the early days of like online social games, like I remember playing like simple text-based, essentially like multiplayer, competitive multiplayer games like Promise Sense. I don't know if anybody ever played that, like way back in the day, where it was basically just like text-based, like how many a text-based like Clash of Clans, right? Like a browser-based Clash of Clans with no graphics, just text. Like the idea of a game like that could obviously just exist on the blockchain forever.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like without anybody ever needing to operate it anymore. Like to me, that's such a cool promise of blockchain gaming that I think somebody will, like, we're not necessarily saying that we're going to be able to achieve that, but once somebody cracks that, I think that's kind of like fulfill the promise of what blockchain gaming has to offer.
Oh, that's fascinating. So many people that, at least that I've talked to, and even myself, I find myself thinking about the actual game and like what the game will look like, what the different universes within the greater metaverse will look like. Of, I want to hop on a dragon and fly around in space and battle it out against intergalactic, whatever. But
Yeah.
But you're even talking about outside of that, where does that experience live?
Right.
How do we get there? What is
Right.
the roadmap to that?
The decentralized existence of a game, like the truly decentralized, the true magic of blockchain is in its decentralized nature, right? And so, like to a degree, I think you could emulate a lot of features of a lot of those like metaverse things without using NFTs, without using any sort of token. I personally think that like the use of a blockchain is a great technology to solve a lot of these problems, but you could theoretically do it with a centralized solution in a lot of cases. But there is one thing that you can't do with a centralized solution, which is a promise of decentralization, right? Like a promise of saying that this will live on no matter what happens to me, and there's nothing that anybody can do to stop that, right? Unless everyone simultaneously stops playing the game. So to me, that's the coolest. I mean, and it might not be. I guess I'm just like a tech nerd, right? To me, that's the coolest thing about blockchain. It's like it may not be the flashiest application of it that you're talking about. Like, how cool is like the metaverse going to be? Yeah, obviously that stuff's cool too, right? But to me, as like a tech nerd and looking at this, is like the promise of that is such a cool technical thing that could happen. That I just can't wait to see.
So, as far as like what needs to happen, or like what boxes need to get checked in order to actually say, okay, now we have done this. Like to me, it seems like, okay, well, the servers and the storage of everything that
Yeah.
needs to be, almost shared amongst all the players and the developers and the community. But then you also will probably need to have rebalancing of different things and
Yeah.
updates from a graphical perspective, from like a stat base. Like one character just might be super OP and they need to be tuned down a little bit, and the community knows, well, there has to be a way to actually like decide on that and then implement that. And then I'm sure as technology gets better, there are going to be more efficient ways to do things, more under the hood quality of life improvements that would need to happen. Like, how do all these things actually happen in a totally decentralized manner to where your game will live on for the next 1,000 years,
Right.
and you don't even have to be here?
Right. So you've touched on two really interesting points. One of which is governance and kind of like configuration management. Right. There's a degree to which, as a game developer, you develop features that are kind of inherent and embedded within the fabric of the game and are not really things that you can change. But every game developer always has the things that we typically call like knobs, that things that you can turn, right? Things that you can very simply say, like, what's the configuration value of this thing? And so there's a couple answers to your question. One is like, what parts of that do you expose to the community and you have to be careful not to give them too much, because they might mess up. Like you have to give them the pieces that you think are absolutely necessary, bounded within the bounds that are absolutely necessary for them to tune the experience of their liking, but not inadvertently break everything. Right. So that's part A. And then part B, which is to me, the more interesting like challenge in terms of like a design and technical challenge, which is, how do you take a complex game, something like CryptoKitties obviously already is like inherently like will just live forever, right? Because every single interaction just exists on the blockchain. There's really isn't anything that doesn't exist on the blockchain, right? But something more complex like our game, where there's game servers that have to run, and people will need to connect to these dedicated game servers, and like how do we decentralize that? The answer is to begin with, we're probably going to have to centralize it, right? Like we're probably going to have to host game servers for players for a while. But at a certain point, can we find a good incentive and moderation or policing structure to trust community members with these game servers, almost as if they were kind of like mining nodes in a blockchain, right? If you kind of, this doesn't hold up perfectly, but if you imagine the community itself as nodes within a blockchain, and then the blockchain is kind of like the entirety of the game operation, and then the players who are running the servers are the individual nodes, and they can like sanity check and police one another, and they can have moderation councils that call bad actors and etc. And things like you gain rewards as a community member who runs a dedicated server for people to play on. Like how can we incentivize that properly so that incentive structure lives on as long as there's people willing to play the game and like contribute resources to it. Those are the types of problems that I'm really interested in trying to solve for ourselves, but also like to see who else kind of takes those on.
And who are maybe it is you and your team, but like, where are we in that? Like, who's on the forefront of that technology and that solution?
It's a good question. I think right now we are one of the few truly like large scale multiplayer games that is planned to be on the blockchain. There are others that have integrated NFT technology, but aren't necessarily trying to solve this problem, I think. So in terms of the ones who are making like large scale multiplayer games, which is kind of like the primary domain in which this is an interesting question, because like anything like even like Axie Infinity and everything else, like you can imagine a world where they can like all of that logic and all of that data could theoretically eventually live on the blockchain for a game of that scope. And
totally.
and that's not a very difficult design or technical challenge from my perspective.
But like World of Warcraft,
right?
Style,
right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So like there's only a handful of people who are even attempting to make games like that. So hopefully out of, either us or one of them, you'll see something really cool in the future that kind of addresses that.
So when you're thinking about like what game you want to build and the role then of NFTs, how did you, because I feel like we kind of touched on the role of the blockchain there. If we missed something, please let me know because I want to explore that. But thinking about like the type of game, what you want to build, what you want to see, how did you come to the conclusion that this is the type of game? And then maybe we could talk about the game and some of the cool mechanics there, and then the role of NFTs within that game.
So we started with the game, and we started with like, and there's no one answer to this, but we started with like, what's a cool game that we really want to make? And, we working with our investors, we had a couple of options, but one of the ones that we came up with was like, there hasn't been another PlanetSide 2 in over 10 years. Like that game came out, I remember 2006, 7, 8, something like that, right? I might be way off. I don't know. I have terrible date memory. But like that, like there hasn't been another like large scale persistent warfare, faction war, multiplayer shooter, mass market, that like that since. And I was addicted to that game. I love that game. So to a degree, we weren't really thinking about NFTs when we answered that question. We were thinking more like, what game do I want to make and what game do I want to play? And when you start with that, you kind of give yourself a box to design within, and you can say like, well, there's a lot of ways to make this work on the blockchain within that context. So what are we going to do? Like, are we going to like have every single drop in the world? Are we going to do like Diablo system? Like what is it? Right. And so we then kind of like figure it out with that as a pillar, like the gameplay as a pillar. How do we create an economy within that from the ground up to support that? And then after that, we kind of started to think like, okay, well, if we're creating this NFT-based blockchain economy to support that game, what else can we do with this NFT-based blockchain economy? And the more we thought about it, the more we were like, well, if we create a really interesting system that fits this game, that's not the only game that will fit, right? Like there's a lot of other types of games that this might service. So we came up with the idea of having like an interesting core kind of mechanic for our NFTs, crafting mechanic, and like economic model for our world, and then building different game experiences on top of that made sense for that, right? So that's kind of how that came about. And ultimately, like we just asked ourselves, like, what do we love doing, and what do we really want to play? So,
and how much did you have to hash these things out within the team? Like, was everybody pretty much like, okay, this is the direction we want to go, or were there a lot of different big ideas that had to be hashed out, for lack of a better term? How did that actually happen internally, that discussion?
well, honestly, we came up with like a number of ideas for, like, once we made that decision, we were like, okay, well, we could see this also as a kind of smaller scale mobile session based game. We could see this as a tactics game. We could see this as like these five, six different experiences, and all of these work with the same foundation, economy foundation. So the question became like, we had a ton of big ideas, but which one did we want to start with? We can't do all those at once, right? So where do we want to kind of like, which part of the market do we want to penetrate first? Like, do we want to appeal to mobile gamers? Do we want to appeal to hardcore PC gamers? Do we want to appeal to a tactics market? Do we want to try and chase the same types of players that are playing Axie Infinity, or do we want to go after the kind of people who are playing Battlefield, right? Like what type of market do we want to go after? And the answer to that question ended up being like partially like, what type of game do we think would be the best experience that we could make in a short period of time? But also, like, our investors answer that question, which is that, like, we want to make the case that an NFT, like one of the core like foundational principles of this endeavor is to make the case that an NFT game can be virtually indistinguishable from a technical and design perspective from a AAA, or III PC game, right? Like, it doesn't have to be its own world of thing. It can be like, this is an experience that you could see, Activision putting out, or you could see it akin to a Battlefield, type game. But it just happens to use NFT as its kind of core economy, as opposed to a free to play title or a premium title, right? And so we decided that this was like the best way to make that case and to prove that point was to say, well, we'll publish a game that is the closest to this kind of like, AAA, experience as we can, and we'll start there. We'll prove that like the most hardcore, like action oriented, multiplayer combat game that's meant for like mass market PC gamers and console gamers can work in the space. And so that's what we're doing.
I love that. So as you've now moved from traditional game making to now crypto blockchain game making, is it more difficult, or is it something that feels like it's just a natural progression of things that actually makes parts of it easier? Like, as far as that transition, like, has it been an easy one, a good one, something that you're like excited about, or how are you thinking about this?
I wouldn't say it's significantly more difficult. I mean, I think there are some technical considerations to make in terms of like simple things, like when you query a database, you're fairly guaranteed to get results in a certain amount of time. Like you can't make certain assumptions that you can make with like a monolithic centralized backend, right? And it's basically things like that you have to think about from a technical perspective. And then from a design perspective, obviously, it's like, how do we balance this economy in such a way that when we hit the big publish button on our smart contract, that's basically it. It's final, right? Like we have to live with that. So I think the biggest challenge is we have to be a lot more sure about what we do before we move forward with it. Like we have to like often in games, you'll hear like the mantra that like iteration is king. And in many cases, what people like to do, especially like recently with this kind of advent of kind of early access titles on Steam and et cetera, is like, well, let's iterate up to a point, but then like expect to potentially change things after we launch once we get people's feedback and et cetera. And like, we don't have the luxury of being able to do that. Like, we need to be absolutely sure that when we've locked our economy down, like that's written in stone. Like, we're done. That's it. And so we're spending a lot more time doing things like economic modeling to ensure that we get that right. Spending a little bit more time on designing those systems to ensure that we have all the valves that we need in order to tweak that. So, I think there's probably a lot of people out there who are kind of like, let's just see if this works. And we're trying to be a little bit more careful. Where ordinarily we wouldn't need to do that. Like, we ordinarily, and like, even in a free-to-play game, like, you can drastically change the model of how players like spend and earn at some point if you run A/B tests and decide that like this model is better than the other one. And we can't do that. So that's probably the biggest challenge.
It's almost like launching a space mission.
Kind of. You get like one shot, right?
Right.
So, but which isn't to say that we can't test things out. Like, we can test things out in small kind of focus groups and in alphas and betas and stuff like that before we have a lot of this stuff written in stone, before we publish our final like game portal contracts and et cetera. Like, we can do a lot of that stuff. And one of the things that we're doing is we're ensuring that as many of the things that we think need to be configurable are, so that if we need to change the most obvious things, like the rate at which players are able to earn tokens by playing various different things, we can do that fairly easily. So it's not, I guess, not fair to say it's written in stone, but like the overall model and like design of it is fairly written in stone. And so we need to be fairly sure of that before we proceed.
What an interesting, what an interesting dynamic. So let's kind of scope out a little bit, and let's just talk about like the market in general. And when I say market, I specifically want to talk about like the crypto gaming industry and the technology behind it. How, in a life cycle, or a chronological perspective, how early are we still when it comes to really doing these things at, like reaching the logical conclusion of the power of them, or like really tapping into the full utility of this technology? Like, how close are we to actually doing that?
I think we're honestly like 50% of the way there. Like, I think
wow.
we already know, we probably know we are doing a lot of the things. I won't say that it's there yet, but it's being like thought of and explored. Like 50% of the way, like actively being worked on and like coming soon. I should say, probably. But the big missing chunk is going to be more of a business case of like when, in terms of like, when does it become economical and when does it like beat out from a business case perspective of like publishing on Steam and doing a free-to-play or premium title. Like, when are you able to say, like, as a small indie developer, I'm just going to make a blockchain game as opposed to publishing on Steam? I mean, Steam is already kind of dead for indies anyways, but that's a whole separate story. But like the point I'm trying to make is like, that to me is a bigger function of bigger moving forces. Like, when is Epic Games going to come out with their own blockchain? Right? Like, when is when are these big movers going to start to enter the market and really influence things like how easy it is for developers to kind of integrate these technologies into their engines and then use them in a way that's secure and compatible with other things. And once that starts happening is when I think you'll kind of start to see the floodgates. Like, I'll use like engines as an example. Is I see the blockchain technology very similar to kind of like game engines have been over the past like 15 years. Like, back in mid to early 2000s, there wasn't any sort of mass market availability for a professional quality game engine for like hobbyists or indies until Unity came out, and until Epic started releasing their Unreal Development Kit, and like that didn't exist, right? And so I think we're at that point now. I think we're like in the, like from an engine perspective, if you're like taking the analogy of like blockchain to engine, we're like in that early 2000s era of like video game engines and like seeing, and whereas like now with UE5 coming out and being like something that literally anyone can learn how to do and publish amazing stuff, that's where I see the blockchain technology going in the next like 10 to 15 years, maybe even sooner than that. And that's the like other 50% that's going to feel like it, from a technical perspective and a business perspective, is maybe another 50%, because like so much effort went into making these engines even into the early 2000s, right? Like a huge amount of effort went into making those, but you didn't start to see that huge mass market adoption and like the way it disrupted entire industries until people started to make that interesting business leap of like, hey, you can have this engine for free now and use it for free and only pay us royalties once you start, making a certain amount of money. That kind of like business step is the next step that I see to unlock what you're talking about.
So for the people who they want to be investing in the future of crypto gaming, blockchain gaming, crypto space, and the metaverse, what would you be looking at as far as like, well, this is the important stuff. Like, would you be looking at it on a game level, on an infrastructure level, on within the game asset level, or like how would you look at that?
I think you could probably do well from any of those perspectives. It's a little bit of I won't pretend to like know that I understand the NFT marketplace like for on an individual asset level, but from a macro level, I think what you should probably be looking at is investing in the people who are trying to make like think about if you were able to invest in Epic Games in the early 2000s.
Right.
Invest like looking at them and saying like, they're trying to make an engine that everyone is going to use and trying to make it ubiquitous, or Unity, right? Trying to make it ubiquitous and appeal to people who are learning things in school. What's being taught in classrooms? What's being taught in college classrooms, right? What's being taught in computer science or game dev classrooms? What what companies are trying to really push that technology as like a mass market, the idea of being like an owner of a huge chunk of the market in the future. You see, people like, Ultra.io who are very deliberately and obviously publicly making that push. But then there might be companies that are very, very privately making that push. For all we know, Epic, like I said, or even Valve, who knows, are doing that too. So to a degree, like maybe it's hard to say for sure, but like if you are able to identify someone that is trying to do that, I think that's where the real return is going to be, and that's where the real like growth is going to come from.
I love it. I love it. So Dan, I want to be really cognizant of your time. Maybe we could just paint a picture of what you see being like some critical milestones for us to know, like, we have arrived at certain stages of this really, really cool path that we're heading down. What are going to be some of the big milestones that we're going to hit, and how will we know when we have arrived fully?
So I think the first milestone is going to be when I hope it's us, like somebody, and probably us, releases a high end, graphically intense, frenetic multiplayer game that you could see being a free to play or premium console title or PC title, and is built on a foundation of NFTs. And I don't just mean a game that people have been working on for a couple of years and then they heard about NFTs and decided we're going to take all of the skins that we were going to sell and make them NFTs instead. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about things that were built from the ground up to run on a true NFT or true blockchain powered economy. And once that is real and live, that'll be the kind of the first big hurdle. The next hurdle will be like adoption by some of these larger, and like acceptance by some of these larger companies. And again, I don't mean like Ubisoft saying that we're going to sell these like, skin achievement things, whatever the hell those things are. I'm talking about like like a big company like Activision or whoever saying that we're going to be doing the exact same thing that like we're doing, except with a 10 times, 100 times the budget. And that's probably going to happen in the next couple of years. Like there's probably going to be like a title that is very similar to like the types of designs you're seeing out of like Star Atlas and Illuvium, that comes out of a major publisher, brainchild of a major publisher, within the next, certainly before like 2023, end of 2023, you'll see something announced like that. Right. And then the next thing, I think the big step after that will be like, when is it so mass market that people start to view it as like a business decision of like, oh, it's almost like equivalent of like, well, do we want to release a blockchain game or do we want to release a Steam game, or do we want to be like, what model are we going to use? And it almost rises to that kind of same level from a complexity standpoint, from like a technical complexity standpoint. It's like it was almost impossible for indie developers to release games on like a first party platform like Xbox or PlayStation in the early 2000s, just because that like knowledge gap was so huge, right? And nowadays it's almost easier than Steam if you're in the know, right? Like if you're in with them, it's almost easier to do that than it is Steam. At what point will blockchain reach that same kind of break-even point where for developers it's as easy to do it as consoles are now for developers compared to where they were 15, 20 years ago. So, and I don't know what the answer to that, but I think it'll come in the form of like a large, either one of the startups that you see like Ultra succeeding in building a major market for themselves, or one of the big companies like Epic or Steam fully embracing it and building it directly into their platform, and integrating it, or Unity or whatever, integrating something into their core engine and having that be available to everybody. So I think that's the big one.
Amazing. Well, Dan, again, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing everything that you have. This has been a really, really interesting episode. We've never really like attacked it from this angle before, so I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Do you have any last comments or ideas or things you want to leave us with?
I'll say join our Discord, discord.gg/MetalCore NFT. And we're always on there. I'm on there answering questions pretty regularly about our game. So if anybody wants to see sneak peeks, get in on the whitelist for the pre-sale or participate in AMAs. I'm on there probably once a week doing an AMA. Or just ask me questions directly, and I'll get back to you guys in short order. And it's a great way for us to connect with the community. And we've got a lot of people on there right now that are very excited for our game. So come join us.
Awesome. Love it. You're the man, Dan. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. To everybody watching and listening, thank you very much. And I'll see you all on the next